In recognition of the priority that Temple University places on enhancing social good, both across the campus and in partnership with our community, I am extremely pleased to introduce Provost Gregory Mandel to kick off the keynote speaker segment of our summit. Provost?
To the 5th Annual Temple University Social Impact Summit. It's wonderful to have you all here. Welcome and thank you for taking the time and giving me time to talk with you. It's particularly endearing to me because, as some of you know, my area of scholarship is in intellectual property law and law and innovation, which is all about how do we promote creativity and innovation. And so it dovetails very nicely with the topic for today. My particular area of focus, in fact, was on drawing inspiration and learning from other fields, such as psychology and human development, to business and economics and engineering and the arts. How do we draw learnings from these fields in order to inform how patent law or copyright law should be adjusted in order to best promote innovation and creativity? So as I said, it works really well with today's topic, and I'm excited to be here to celebrate. I think it goes without saying that today, perhaps more than ever, the world needs entrepreneurial and innovative approaches to address complex and systemic societal problems that create inequality across multiple domains, from lack of access to the most basic human needs, to the opportunity to earn a fair wage, to the ability to express a unique viewpoint or restoring the environment for coming generations. Many of our Temple students have directly experienced these issues, and many more want to create positive change. This summit and a range of other social impact programs are led by Fox School's Innovation and Entrepreneurship Institute, with support from a number of other schools, colleges, and centers across the university. These programs help inspire, enable, and empower our Temple students, alumni, and faculty, as well as surrounding communities, and showcase that anyone from any discipline can change themselves, Temple, Philadelphia, and the world for the betterment of all. During the Changemaker Challenge that just ended, you saw the power of ideas from 6 different colleges and schools within Temple University. My congratulations to the winners and to all of those who submitted their ideas along the way. Keep on pushing to make a difference. You are all change makers. Now I would like to introduce 2 other significant change makers who are role models for each of us. Founder of Grant Boulevard, Dr. Kimberly McGlonn's guiding mission as a social entrepreneur is to advocate not only for the historically and currently marginalized, but for the preservation of our planet. We look forward to an engaging conversation led by Shay Marie Strauser, a Fox undergraduate who will graduate this May with a degree in marketing and a minor in corporate social responsibility. Shay is also a sustainability intern at Grant Boulevard and active participant in Temple's many social impact-oriented activities. I'm pleased to turn things over to Shay as she continues with this afternoon's event. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Provost Mandel. I am really excited to be here this evening with Dr. Kimberly McGlonn, CEO and founder of Grant Boulevard, design strategist with Build It Boldly, and the co-host of the podcast, School for Disruptors. Kimberly, thank you for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Me too. I'd like to just kick things off with Kimberly, you telling us about yourself and your life's journey up to this point.
Yeah, let's see. So, gosh, where to start? I'm a girl from the north side of Milwaukee, right? A place that Dr. King called the Selma of the North. And I think it's so important when we think about the journeys that are our lives to really contextualize them in the places where we come from and the people who have loved us into existence. And so much of what has led me to see the world the way that I do is about the house I grew up on Grant Boulevard. That's the story, right? So, you know, I left Milwaukee when I was 18. I headed off to Louisiana, spent about 10 years in the South, undergrad through my Ph.D. at LSU. And then I found my way here, essentially. And along that way, I picked up a lot of new understandings about the state of things and about how I wanted to be in relation with the state of things, how I wanted to kind of use my time and talent. So the longer journey, I think, has always been about, you know, how am I standing in an honest position with myself, and then how am I using my understandings to, yeah, so I fell into the classroom at 21, right? So, and then that led me to kind of be thinking about leadership, I think, in ways I hadn't thought about, grace in ways I think I hadn't thought about, and then I found myself teaching a course in marginalization, disenfranchisement in the American story, teaching another course in colonialism, and like, you know, getting young people to be thinking about the state of the world from the lens of the longer story, you know, like really wanting to figure out how do you look out at the world and think about the before, right? And then like the why and the who and the how and the what, you know, what was taken, what was left. And then that led me to be thinking about systems designs. So yeah, so in 2016, which is kind of like the nexus, the genesis story of Grant Boulevard, I was very much so still thinking about, you know, how did I want to show up, and thinking about who are the voices I was listening to that were going to inform my understanding of the world and how I wanted to, you know, have an impact.
Yeah. So how did you fall into design?
Yeah, so my PhD is actually in curriculum design.
Okay.
And so I've been thinking about studying, you know, who learns what, and, you know, who gets to teach, and how do you approach, you know, planning from the perspective of really doing something that in ways from the classroom space felt radical. Mm-hmm. So thinking about design for me has been with me for a really long time, you know, and leadership in the ways in which classroom teachers, if we think about, you know, who our favorite teachers were, I think oftentimes we can think about how they were in ways these magical conductors of a lot of things. Like each of us were our own instruments, and they pulled together this symphony of minds and tried to build something beautiful. So, you know, my PhD was really in thinking about design strategies for people. And I still think when I think about the building out of a business, which is ultimately what I've been leveraging that longer experience to do, it's still about thinking about how do you create a symphony of from all of these various perspectives and talents and, you know, longings and struggles. And I think that is really what the work of a really exceptional CEO is being able to really see people from that lens, and then, you know, moving away from like basic understandings of humans as capital, right? But really thinking about people as these really potent sources, this really rich soil for not just your own ideation and the birthing and evolution of your own ideation, but the birthing of their own evolution and you know, how they're thinking about their own journeys. And so yeah, that's kind of like, it's been a similar arc, I think, in a lot of ways.
So falling into your first business here, how did you and why did you start Grant Boulevard?
Yeah, it certainly was like circuitous, you know,
Yes.
like had to like move around a bit, because, you know, being in the classroom to thinking about, you know, fashion design in particular. But I think when I think about Grant Boulevard particularly, I think about my own journey to discover the places in my life where there was pain and understanding, and the places in my life where there was passion. And for me, a pain point was really coming into an understanding of our criminal system. And, you know, Milwaukee, where I'm from, we have some of the highest pockets of concentrated communities of people who are formerly incarcerated. Yeah. And I've loved and still love deeply people who are currently incarcerated. So, you know, for me, realizing that felt like a pain point, it was a journey of, and this is a catalyst moment for me was the documentary by Ava DuVernay, 13th. We all have these things that are like accelerators of our understanding. And then for social entrepreneurs, it's like, how do you tap into that accelerator of understanding and then align it with your passion? I found out that there was this place, this new understanding of where there was pain. And then I thought about how I could tap into things that felt like places of actual pleasure, right? Like there's fashion design for me, color, textiles, story, textures. Those were always places of pleasure for me. I grew up in thrift stores. It's where I first learned about fabrics and learned about like the architecture of fashion design, the ways in which you can use your closet to time travel, to tell the story of mood or feeling, to start a conversation, and to teach, right? Like for me, fashion's still about teaching. I'm a teacher at heart. I think social entrepreneurs have to be teachers. And even if you don't come into social entrepreneurial pursuits with an understanding of what it means to be a good teacher, I think you're a better leader, a better innovator, a better, just, you can sit differently with the work that is building an enterprise like that if you can figure out and identify with your favorite teachers. Because that's what, in a moment where people don't really have an understanding of what it means to be a social entrepreneur, they're learning new language for sustainability and impact, you got to teach. And so, so fashion design for me was like, I want to respond to this pain. I want to do it in a way that aligns with something that feels like a real authentic place of passion. And for me, pivoting to figuring out how to create jobs was really like, how do I do that? Wasn't going to be in the classroom. I thought about where I found joy, and there still is joy for me in fashion design. And so that's like the intersection that we're, I want everybody to get to.
Right. So I hear you about pleasure.
Yeah.
Right? And I want to talk about disruption.
Yeah.
And your vision for disruption and how it's developed over time, from you being a teacher, getting your Ph.D, starting Grant Boulevard. How has this developed over time? And what is disruption in your mind?
It's such a beautiful question, because I think, the spirit of social entrepreneurship, at the heart of it, this is what I've discovered, it is about disruption, right? And there are these micro level disruptions and there are these macro level disruptions that we all can kind of figure out what our lane is into participation. Another metaphor is like getting to the front line for this work. For me, when I think about the totality of my identities, which there are so many, we look at people, we think we make assumptions about how they identify, and there are so many things that live beneath the surface of what you think you're perceiving. Understanding and owning my identities has always been about understanding that I'm intersectional, and that sometimes my very existence in a space creates disruption, whether I intend to or not. Yeah. And when I moved into a sense of self-possession about that, I think it freed me up to think about how I am in space as a mechanism for creating ripples, right? So I do that in the classroom. I do that in my role as a councilwoman. I do that in my work as a co-host of a podcast. And when I'm doing it, the intention is not actually to create this sense of like systems collapse. It's just like a fracturing. It's the thawing of the ice that keeps us trapped into outdated philosophies and values and systems that do more to oppress us than they do to actually set us up for the real win, right? Which is how do we figure out how to slow down this climate catastrophe? How do we figure out how to save this democracy? So those are things that I think are a part of like owning identity that have been a part of my journey.
Yeah. Disruption. You believe it's required for change.
I do.
Yeah.
And I think what is at the floor of even disruption is the courage to confront.
Yes.
And I think that is what's required for change, right? You confront, and I think that that's also very personal. Like, I think we sometimes it's easy to confront away from us, but the real work is in confronting yourself. Yeah. The maps you have of your life, the maps you have for your identity. Once you do that work, you set yourself up to lead.
Yeah. So talking about this change, what do you hope Grant Boulevard achieves?
Oh, Grant Boulevard.
Yes.
I hope what Grant Boulevard achieves is I hope it does what it set out to do, which is to really help the fashion industry, and by extension, all industries that are so dependent on people, to think differently and more critically about the ways in which exploitation, like the dismissal of the human experience, the reduction of access to rights, the suppression of workers, of souls through wage restrictions. Yeah. I want it to be a real example, a real beacon, of like, if we center things differently, if we act with integrity, despite the challenges that creates, like, the exhaustion and the struggle to find the capital, which are all a part of business ownership, that we can actually be imagining through Grant Boulevard a radical future. And that idea of inspiring other social entrepreneurs to be thinking more boldly about radical imaginings for what comes next, that right there, that is what keeps me in it. Yeah.
So a big focus for Grant Boulevard with your mission is employing formerly incarcerated individuals. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, there's so many things to think about that, right? Like,
yeah.
This longer history that now y'all know of thinking about how to really elevate understanding about what it means to be disenfranchised, who benefits from disenfranchisement, and then narrowing that really in on the story of Black folk as an extension of, you know, the longer American legacy of slavery and the comfort with that kind of exploitation. And the ways in which that's still showing up in our systems, particularly in the ways in which people, because of their histories of conviction, history of arrest in some places, get, you know, pushed out, right? There is like the stripping of voting rights, the limited housing, you know, inability to find wage, you know, fair wage jobs. That's what I wanted to kind of show up in the face of. And so in 2019, we launched our first beta cohort of working with women who were formerly incarcerated or had some touchstone with the criminal system to just pilot, right? That's what betas are about, is piloting, you know, what would it look like to do some radical experimentation in terms of identifying these women and figuring out how to support them in daily life, how to train them, how to retain them. And then the pandemic happened. And that really, you know, teaching sewing is such an intimate thing that we had to figure out. And this is what it means to be a social entrepreneur, is you're constantly figuring out what's the next pivot. You know, you're moving from a place, and your literal physical movement is like you center what it means to be nimble.
Yeah.
And so I'm super excited. I'm really excited that we have an incredibly committed nonprofit partner in Philadelphia, where in the spring of this year, we're going to relaunch a program that's twice the size of the one that we started with in 2019. It's going to put us in a third manufacturing space, a learning lab that will help us to actually create not just the training opportunities, but the jobs, to do all the things they set out to do from the beginning. And actually, I think to hopefully transition in ways how Grant Boulevard is even approaching production, which I think is what it, you know, like when we think about what does it mean to be a sustainable business, it's what are the lanes of revenue? How are you thinking about what those streams will look like? And so super excited to do the work around impact, and super excited to do the work around, you know, really thinking about how to build a social enterprise that is doing what a lot of businesses right now are struggling with, which is profitability.
Yes. Yeah. Profits with a purpose.
That's right.
Yes. Hearing you talk about fashion here, production and design, can you explain a bit more circular fashion?
Yeah.
And what we're doing with Grant Boulevard in the environmental area?
Yeah. You know, when we think about Grant Boulevard as one example, for us in the fashion industry, it's about thinking about what our textile strategies are. You know, like every business has so many different kinds of strategy. What's your marketing strategy? What's your PR strategy? What's your fundraising strategy? When you're centering sustainability, you have to have a strategy for waste management. You have to have a strategy for thinking about what are the decisions that you're making and how are they in relation to climate positivity. And so for us, that means really zeroing in on in our design. How do we approach fashion design from a zero waste mindset, which means using fabrics that already exist and reimagining them? How are we using fabrics that come from larger overages from companies that don't have our same commitments to sustainability to reduce, you know, our need to rely on freshly produced bolts of fabric? And it means thinking about how we're thinking about our scraps. How are we utilizing the things that are in our, you know, just like a zero waste pattern making approach to really center just our what we're contributing to landfills, essentially.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I want to kind of talk about you taking leadership in this space, in Philadelphia and beyond. What inspired you to do that?
You know, I think that what it means to be a leader is to really step out on your own sense of just being self-directed.
Yeah.
And then leadership is when other people see what you're putting out there, and then they say, you know what, I want to see where this goes. And sometimes there are things that we can do that are really just demonstrating courage and bravery that attract that kind of momentum. And sometimes it's about how are you telling the story about what you're doing in ways that are really engaging people and feeling like they want to be a part of what it is that you're building. And I think that leadership is all of those components. So in the beginning, I don't necessarily think I set out with real intentionality that being a leader in the fashion industry was what I was aspiring to do. Right. More than being a leader, I wanted to be a disruptor. And I didn't recognize then that to disrupt is to lead. Yes. And so that's been like a later learning that, you know, in seeking to disrupt, you are by default, you are ultimately seeking to lead.
What are your biggest challenges and disappointments? You know, through this journey, being with Grant Boulevard and as a disruptor.
Challenge and disappointment. Oh my goodness. I think one challenge is that, you know, we're talking about the things that social entrepreneurs are most concerned with. You know, it's heavy, you know, like talking about the state of the planet is heavy. Talking about, you know, the ways in which, you know, people are experiencing economic struggle or emotional struggle or environmental struggle based on, you know, what's happening around them. So very heavy things. And figuring out a language to make that accessible for consumers who are maybe just they're coming new to these things. I think that can be a challenge. And I think that for me, what I'm learning in my leadership is that part of it is really doing some work around consumer education. That's important. People need to know and understand what motivates you. But I think it's also tapping into the feelings that you want to produce in people, whether it's optimism or you want to tap into sex appeal or you want to tap into, you know, whatever it is that is the note you want to hit. I think that can be a challenge, you know, like when you really are trying to do something that's kind of in ways maybe like avant-garde or confrontational. I think that's a challenge. I think another challenge is that, you know, consumers are waking up to this idea that this is what the moment demands of us. And I think that for those of us who are already kind of like leading in this direction, that means we're ahead, right? To lead is to be ahead. And I think that sometimes that can feel like a challenge in terms of like, how are we securing financing to do some bold experimentation? How are we, you know, growing our community and our customer base beyond people who already know what's up, who are already thinking about sustainability, who are already thinking about impact and their own relation to how they want to be involved with businesses. So I think that those are definite challenges. And in the fashion industry, you know, so much of the industry's habits are toxic. So to be saying that that we collectively are challenging what has been normalized, there are a myriad of challenges to doing that, to being confrontational in that way.
Right. So what do you consider to have been your biggest accomplishment at Grant Boulevard so far?
Ooh, so many. I think one is opening a storefront, a brick and mortar in the pandemic. I think that showed a lot of gall on our part, that we were willing to say, like, we're looking at the landscape of the world, and we, you know, like there was certainly a moment we were deciding, like, are we going to just say now is not the time, or are we going to look at the landscape of the world and say we're persevering and pushing through regardless? And I think that the decision to say that forward was the motion, that's like an internal mantra of ours, forward is the motion. Yeah. I think tapping into that is an incredible sign of success. I think when you hear about how our team talks about the work that we do together and how nutritious it's been in a moment when the world feels so chaotic and we all feel so kind of untethered to what is normal, to hear the people who we brought together, both in terms of like our community of who are our followers, or people who are working on our team in-house, there's so much love. You know, like there's a real deep sense that people feel like they're investing in something that's giving something back to them. Yeah. And I think that for a business to be able to offer that, particularly in a moment that's so challenging, it's an incredible accomplishment. Yeah. There's so many. I can't. Yeah, there's been certainly lots. We shipped last year to 30 states. We were able to bring 24 small business owners into shared space with us. That's huge. We were able to produce almost 4,500 hours in living wage work. It's huge, you know, like at a time when people didn't have jobs, we were paying, you know, living wage to people right here in Philadelphia. That's huge. And we know that in Philadelphia, you know, 40% of residents are African American, less than 3% of businesses are owned by Black folk, smaller percent of that are owned by women, and a smaller percent of that employ more than just the owner. So to be sitting and knowing that, you know, like I employ, a growing number of people that's another huge accomplishment for a Black-owned business in Philadelphia.
Yeah. Grant Boulevard is a family. And when you come to the storefront, you can just feel that.
That's the hope. Yeah, that's the hope. I mean, it's a living room and a reimagined car garage. And it really, the ambition has always been, we wanted the space to feel like a living room. Yeah. That it was like we are living, you know, like we are alive, and this thing that we're building is very much so alive.
Yes. So we're here today to talk about beyond the triple bottom line.
Yeah.
You speak about business with a purpose. So I want to tap into that. What inspires you, beyond what inspires, but what to make these intentional, purpose-driven decisions beyond, you know, the 3 Ps that we're used to?
Yeah, I think that so much about, and I said this, you know, earlier, but I want to go back to it because I think it's the place that we are most likely to run away from, which is really understanding where there's a sense of angst and anxiety and pain. I think that those are the places that we are called to, once we face it, to really be able to be empowered to boldly show up. because we've done the hard work of exhibiting incredible courage.
Yeah.
When I think about what has caused me anxiety and pain, it's like I've been on my own since I was 14. And I know that when I think about that longer personal story, when I face that pain, it's a story about, trying to figure out how to survive poverty. And that's a pain point for me. And I think when I faced that and really was able to move through shame, there's so much shame about poverty. There's so much shame about, family dysfunction. Once you move beyond that and you conquer that, it sets you up to be able to do some really amazing things. And so I think that is part of it, and I think the other part of it, if I step more immediately into my current life, I've loved literally my 18 years as a classroom teacher, thousands of young people. I'm the mother of a young person, and I think when I think about my legacy in the face of what I'm offering them in terms of a model of resistance, I really feel firmly that that's something that they deserve, that the world will be made richer by their having that kind of example. So for me, part of my purpose is I know the struggle. I know the struggle of those things and those places personally. And I know that the importance of having, kind of like anchors who are just saying, like, we will resist. We are the resistance, and we refuse to kind of like give in to pessimism. Mm-hmm. And if in a moment that's so hard, if I can be a voice of some optimism, Frederick Douglass said that, pessimism is a tool of the oppressor. And if I can offer something that is an antidote to that pessimism, then that is, I take a lot of pride in that as being a part of my personal legacy, right? Yeah. Building boldly, social entrepreneurship, thinking about impact is really about thinking about legacy. And it's thinking about, service above self. And that's always been a part of what I've kind of felt excited to do. And I still feel very aligned with.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm sure we're all inspired by how your personal values are reflected right into your business.
Girl, I get tired though.
Yes.
I get really tired, you know, and sometimes I look out in the world and I get sad and I get overwhelmed and I feel like, does this small thing matter?
Yeah.
And ultimately, somehow I return to, like our job isn't to like move the whole ocean. Our job as singular individuals is to just aspire to create ripples. And when I make myself small again, when I step into my smallness, it helps me to realize that, that it matters, that you matter, that I matter, that we matter. And I think when we really remind ourselves that we matter, I think it's a powerful tool for figuring out how to persevere through the exhaustion and the sadness, which are all very a part of the experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So a lot of people who want to make an impact think profits are a dirty word, right?
Yeah.
And you've talked about the necessity of profits in business, and because they can make a difference.
Yeah.
Right. So can you just explain this? Let's talk about profit.
And I want to start it by acknowledging why people are so opposed or why they're triggered by notions of profit.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is because we live in a culture where what becomes so heroic is this gross hoarding of resources. Yeah. And I think that so when people have a resistance to this notion of profit, I imagine that a lot of that is a recoiling from a landscape that's so proliferated by figures that have no concern about how they are, just kind of grossly exploiting natural resources and humans for the sake of, gross profit. So that's real. I understand the resistance to traditional notions of the quest for profit.
Yeah.
I will say that when I think about Grant Boulevard and what we do, if the purpose of this business is to pay people a living wage, right? That's like, we're acknowledging that in this moment, people need to have access to particularly creative pursuits that allow them to feed themselves, right? And in order to get to that, we have to generate revenue, right? And that's the only way that we can move that work forward. So if the profit that you're doing is being reallocated, is being treated with integrity, right? If you're communicating with your customers, with your clients, why it is that your product or service is priced the way that it is, if you're you're really managing things with a sense of transparency, profit is not a bad thing. It's incredibly important. It's when you're not doing those things, when you move out of balance with those things, that you contribute to the toxicity of the current kind of system. So no, you need profit. Bills have to be paid, right? Wages have to be paid, investments have to be made. We as small business owners are competing with much larger companies that have much larger budgets. we need to get to a sense of profitability so that we can not just survive, so we can thrive, right?
Yeah.
And that's the goal. We want to have a new landscape of businesses that are thriving with a sense of just integrity, and that means that we have to be profitable.
Yes.
Right. So profit is awesome. It's an incredible thing.
Yeah. I think this is a great segue into your recent launch, Build It Boldly.
Yes.
Please tell us what it is and why you formed it.
Yeah, Build It Boldly is now my second company, which is I did not think 5 years ago I'd be like moving into second, third companies, but that, I don't know, they say that entrepreneurship is like that thing. It's like tattoos. Once you get one, you just kind of gotta, and I don't have any tattoos, so, we'll see how that goes. But the second business that I formed in 2021 is a social community. It's a digital platform to help kind of give a little more robust, I think, understanding to people who are thinking about social entrepreneurship. And that's existing people who currently have businesses who haven't thought about what their impact is in terms of climate positivity, in terms of people, but are thinking, they're coming into an awareness that might be a healthier directional push for how they show up in the world. Yeah. Build It Boldly aspires to give them some of that kind of deep, rich, tender understanding of what it means to be a social entrepreneur. So it's a series of online courses where, just like this, people get to really settle into some intimate conversation with me and what I've learned in my journey as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, in terms of the importance of centering purpose. We move into the importance of thinking about that quadruple bottom line, which is purpose and passion, profit, and there's so many things in those P's that kind of come into play. Yeah. And then we move into some real robust language, some shared language about what does it mean to create community, to disrupt. What does it mean to center impact? What is greenwashing? Mm-hmm. So it's really about creating some shared language around what it means to be a social entrepreneur, and then nurturing people into really bold leadership in their enterprises based on sharing what I've learned. And bringing them into community with people who are aspiring to the same thing. Being a business owner can be so lonely, and so it's really, I think, great to be thinking about how to build some place where we can, be safe in that journey to figure out how to be bold.
Yeah, I love that. I can't wait to start my own business and work with Build It Boldly. For the students and the alumni, the community, the members in the audience who want to make a difference, who want to make a positive impact or just an impact in general, but they don't know how. Yeah. What do you suggest they do?
I think that there's two directions that the start kind of positions you, sets you up to need to center. Right. I think the first work is actually, and this is the hardest work. I'm telling you right now, it's the hardest work. It's going inward. It's like self-awareness. When you move into rooms and you're talking about things that are really nuanced, which conversations about climate apocalypse, climate change, the need for climate action are, you're talking about impact, whether it's centering communities of people who are formerly incarcerated or people who are homeless or, whatever it is that you're refugees, all of those require nuance. And if you're going to show up in those spaces with some real credibility and authenticity, you have to be centered in who you are in relation to those communities and why it is that you deserve to be welcomed there. Yeah. And I think the other place that comes with that, right? Because if you're doing work where you're serving people, they need to feel like you're listening to them. Mm-hmm. So you have to you're stepping into your own identity, you're stepping into your courage, you're stepping into your vulnerability, and then you're the outward facing work that comes next is you're doing research and you're listening with deference to the places where you want to show up. Like when I'm not a formerly incarcerated person. So, and it wasn't until actually within the last year that someone who I love deeply, like in my immediate family, where that became like, this is now, I am feeling this experience in my body versus it being a cerebral processing. Mm-hmm. But I spent time going into prisons. I spent time talking with people who were formerly incarcerated in deep, honest, vulnerable conversation with them about what their experience and their journey was. I read a lot. I did a lot of research. So, we can't show up in an old model of, I know better, so I'm going to save. We have to show up in a new model that says that I know some things and I want to learn. Right. And that I want to leverage my learning to be of service in the ways that the people who I seek to help want to be helped, want to be assisted, want to be, want me to stand in solidarity with, right? We don't save people. We set people up to empower them to figure out what they want their journey to be. And impact work that's done, I think, the most successfully has respect for that. So I think that's where you start, right? You start by getting familiar with you and why do you want to show up in this work? What is it about your journey that sets you up uniquely to be even qualified to do that work? Mm-hmm. Really, truly. And then you figure out what is your place to be in conversation with the places where you want to show up, so that you're bringing something that's rich and sincere and real.
Yeah, yeah. I really want to wrap this up by talking about how do women raise capital?
Yeah, and I think by extension, how do Black folk raise capital?
Exactly.
How do people who identify as queer or gender non-conforming, how do they raise capital? When you sit outside of the language, right, and the rooms and the networks where capital is typically distributed. And I do think that it is about, and this is why, this is in part why I founded Build the Boldly, why I launched that, is because there is so much language that keeps us out. And I wanted to kind of demystify what it is that stops women from being able to get capital. What are the triggers? What are the push points, the pressure points, the cracks in the code that stops us from being able to move with ease and confidence in spaces where we've been intentionally kind of we've just been excluded from. Right. I think that there are a lot of strategies for raising capital as a woman. I think that a part of it is really it's not relying on one strategy. I think I've probably employed at this point 5 clear strategies for raising capital. And so it's about moving through stages and then revisiting stages of the different ways in which capital can be brought to you and can be sought by you. I think it is really understanding who's in your network, and sometimes that's about imagining who's your allies, who can see your struggle and wants to figure out how to help you. And then even on the next level, recognizing who are your accomplices, people who are I'm willing to make a sacrifice because I recognize your struggle as a woman, as a queer person, as a gender nonconforming person, and I'm willing to actually give something up. I'm gonna put you on to this person, or I'm gonna introduce you to these people, or I'm gonna share my personal resources because I really want to stand in kind of courageous solidarity with you. So I do think it's about taking a number of strategies. It's not one.
Thank you so much for an engaging conversation, Kimberly. Tonight has been beautiful, and I just want to remind everyone to throw any questions you have in the YouTube chat, and we will now be passing it over for the Q&A portion.
Nevada Gray.
My name is Becca Austin.
My name is Emma Dietz.
My name is Cassandra Silva.
My role at Grant Boulevard is I am the Director of Production and Design. I have a team that I work with, and we appreciate everyone's feedback. So it's a very collective thing. I almost feel like it can't be duplicated because there is a sisterhood amongst Grant Boulevard, and some of those details is purely on what feels right with the team, and they can change in a blink of an eye. The design process really consists of, the simple question, would you wear it?
My mom taught me how to sew when I was young. I'm a home sewer, so there's a lot that I did not know coming into Grant Boulevard. And I've been really fortunate to learn a lot of professional skills here and learning how to really perfect my craft.
Feels like we are a company of people who care about changing things from the ground up. It's not just about making cool clothes, it's making cool clothes that have a message and a purpose and real heart behind them. Because it's easy to say that you care, but it's a lot harder to show that you care.
The design team at Grant Boulevard is so fun. I get to come to work, have great conversations, sew. We're all nerds for sewing and crafting and everything like that. So it's just a really fun environment.
I didn't really know anything about Grant Boulevard before I started working here. I did some research and I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I believe. I'm like, man, Black women owned, sustainable, environmentally friendly, against mass incarceration. I was like, man, this was made for me. It was made for me. I felt like I manifested this job.
Sustainability is, to me, the ultimate way, almost the one way that we can do this and we can get it right and we can solve all these other existing problems. We can bring attention to all these other existing things, but we're still fashion, right? So I want everyone to recognize our design process, our talent, our skill. It's no reason to me that even in today, one of our garments couldn't be on the world's biggest magazine.
Really nice to have a space with like-minded people where you're you know, you're crafting, you're doing what you love, and you also get to be uplifted by the people around you. It feels like a healing place for me.
Hello, my name is Ebo Nunu. I am a senior at the Fox School of Business, and I'm going to be moderating the Q&A session with Dr. Kimberly McGlonn. We've had a really robust discussion, you know, with Shay, and now we're going to hear some questions that, you know, the audience want to know. You know, some may be a little, you know, tricky, but I will start off, you know, in the culture that I come from, which is I'm from Ghana. Story is important. You know, the way it is told, and the stories that are told about people, and the stories that people tell about themselves. I want to understand what narrative you have to tell yourself as an entrepreneur of color, as an entrepreneur that's working in a space that's very nuanced in sustainability. What is the narrative that you have to tell yourself in order to keep going?
That's a really great question. I think that, you know, in truth, every day presents us with a new challenge. And I think one thing that's been very liberating for me is to give myself some permission to change that narrative as I see fit. I feel that I get to choose that narrative, right? And I feel like when I take that kind of self-possession over how I speak to my mind, this is like, you know, the inside voice. When I take that self-possession over the inside voice, for me, that inside voice, and this has been years of like cultivation, right? We are not always born with these perfect voices of how we communicate with ourselves. And so I've had to learn that, you know, I think about how would I speak to a young person? You know, like how tender would I be? How much grace would I give? How much patience would I demonstrate? And one thing I've been working on lately, just navigating everything that is at this moment, both in all the ways, is really focusing on giving myself a narrative that I can give myself permission, right? So I've been literally, this week I wrote down like maybe 20 ways I want to give myself permission, right? I give myself permission to choose, to say no, to share my words, to hold my words. Yeah, so for me, one of those major narratives is that, you know, like, it's my story, it's my language, and I get to choose it. And every day, I choose.
Amazing. I just love the theme of choice. I love the theme of confronting yourself internally and doing that deep reflection in order to, you know, get to, you know, what your purpose is.
Yes. And that challenge for the day, you know, I get to choose to say, I want to say yes to these things. I want to say no to these things. I want to do them this way. I want to not do them anymore. And I think that right now, really sincerely, that's been really helpful to me. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to take a few questions. So one of the questions that have come through is, so who is your favorite author, and what book has made an impact in your journey?
Oh gosh, there have been so many books. I was an English major, so it's like, guys, there's so many books. I really love philosophy, in truth. I really like poetry a lot. There are a lot of poets who I really am really moved by lately. I would say like super duper lately. I've been reading, like as of today, I've been reading Bell Hooks, African-American philosopher, theorist, but she speaks in really casual ways. You know, like when we hear theory, we hear philosophy, I think we get turned off by it. We feel like it's just so academic that it's not accessible. It's not with Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks wrote a book called All About Love. Mm-hmm. You know, and love is, you know, I really think that this work of being a social entrepreneur is about being tender with yourself, right? Because that's to do work for other people, with other people. It requires you to be practicing some real tenderness with you. And then that gets extended over and over again outward. So I've been reading from Bell Hooks. That's been really nutritious for me. I read this book. He's an Irish philosopher, poet. His name is David Whyte. I love David Whyte. He writes a book that I read every year. It's called Crossing the Unknown Sea. It's the pilgrimage of work. And it's about our relationship with how we define work and what we get from work, what we give to the work that we choose. Yeah, those are two things that kind of sit top of mind because I've been really thinking about them. Oh, I just read last week. This is the last one, I promise. I'm really in like a reading wave, which is kind of unusual. I've been committing myself. Is The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck, who wrote in 1920s, 1926. He wrote this book about the journey, about what it means to like really make the most of this life and kind of making it sacred, for lack of a better word. And that really is the best word. So those are, y'all got all the things. Favorite author though, truthfully, is James Baldwin. Like there's a precision of language that James Baldwin has that, I really aspire to, James Baldwin, he cuts. He speaks truth in ways that I think leadership requires.
Yep.
And so James Baldwin is like one of my go-tos.
Oh, wonderful.
Like love him.
Yeah, that's really amazing. In terms of philosophy, I just got introduced to this Nigerian philosopher called Bayo Akomolafe.
Not familiar. Put it on the list.
Right. And he, in the same guise of, your, activism, puts it very poignantly and says that sometimes it's not the solution, it's not the problem, it's all the solutions that we formed around it. And I feel like you speak very well to that and interrogating the solutions that exist right now and having, creating the space for people to find other solutions, people that have not typically been invited to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, very much so that.
Well, so let me go into the next question. What have been some of the largest challenges you faced while working to achieve a sustainable brand?
I think I can speak from what is a very industry-specific concern, and depending on what industry is yours, every industry will present them, right? Because so much of our larger supply chains, whether you're talking about tech, or you're talking about the food and beverage space, or you're talking about fashion, they're also problematic, right? The supply chain is inherently problematic. I'll say in the fashion space, it's really challenging to find to source fabrics that are both sustainable and affordable. And as a brand that is aspiring to make sustainable fashion accessible, right? We want to have a price point that we can really make what is oftentimes an elite space. And y'all may know this, conversations about sustainability often, they exclude a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. We want to make that accessible. And so for us, figuring out how to find sustainably sourced fabrics that are just affordable has been one of those challenges for sure. I think the other challenge is that as Black women designers, my director of design, our director of design, Nevada Gray, production, the way we want to tell stories in fashion is really communicating what is true for us as Black women. And oftentimes, there's a space where Black women have not been engaged in conversations about sustainability, right? So we're trying to create that conversation. We want to create a space where it's a radically inclusive space in fashion, and that means it includes us. And even more, we shift it a little further, it centers us. And I think that when you're trying to do that, there are challenges to figuring out how do you bring in new audiences to conversations about sustainability, which are really, that will transcend industry, right? The way forward with climate change has to include everybody, and that's not the world we live in, right? We are ever more divided in some ways. And so that's a challenge. How do you make these conversations about sustainability and impact inclusive? And that's still something that I believe in.
Bring it to the last mile. Bring it to the people that matter the most.
Yeah.
Center people that are at the core of facing all the. And
oftentimes in sustainability, often suffer the most robust consequences.
Absolutely.
So that it goes further, right?
Yeah.
And so it becomes, how do we make that kind of shift? Absolutely. And if we can't make that kind of shift, then our work to try to figure out how to address climate change, it will be too slow, which means it'll be too late. And so that's the impetus for figuring out how do we really get to, inclusive, sustainable conversations.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you for that answer. So I have a question about profits. I'm going to try and read that. It says, how do you see the role of profit, and how should social entrepreneurs relate to profits? Where in the totem pole should it?
Of all of the considerations?
Yes.
That's a great question. I do think, this is now year 5. I founded Grant Boulevard in 2017. So, I think where I would have answered that question 5 years ago or 4 years ago might actually fall differently than where I land now. And it's a question I actually hadn't considered. So you guys are going to really get the raw, okay?
That's what we want.
You're going to get the raw.
First.
Okay, I'm going to give it to you how it's coming to me. I think that the first thing that I think in the ranking of things, and now my formula for what it means to be a really robust, sustainable business probably has 5 arms. Like we're thinking about purpose, I'm thinking about planet, I'm thinking about people, I'm thinking about passion, and I'm thinking about profit, right? And I don't know that it's helpful to actually decide that you want to separate them out in terms of rank order, because I do think that the current model that we have is such a problematic effort to do that. And I think if we try to figure out how to reimagine that, we're going to find ourselves in the same tight spot. I think instead of looking at it as it being linear, I actually think we should look at it as being circular, where it's not so much that we're trying to move into this hierarchy of what we're prioritizing, because all of them have to be prioritized. When we talk about intersectionality, it's not about figuring out which one comes first. They have to be in conversation with each other. So I really want to challenge whoever that wonderful human is that asked that question. I want to challenge you to reframe that understanding in terms of it being a straight line into it being a circle, right? Like we need to move through all of those considerations and holding them, aspiring to hold them equal. We need them all. And I think if we try to say that we're going to put profit last or we're going to put planet first, we're losing sight of the greater work, which is at this hour is tending to them all simultaneously. And that's no small order, right? Like I recognize that's a mindset shift. And from this side, 5 years later, I very clearly can see the challenges of trying to figure out how to hold them in balance. And I think the circle might be the healthiest way of literally holding them, right? Of literally figuring out how to bring them close, is to think of it as this motion, versus like this motion, right? The hierarchies that we're so comfortable with, because that's what we've been conditioned to think about, how we respond to things, they're stifling, and they don't allow us to do the larger work, which is community, which is togetherness, which is the balance, right? So right now I'm feeling like this is the way. Yeah.
Thank you for those insights. It's really refreshing to hear that, especially for somebody that is in business, and you seem to have found a way of making all of those important parts, that you mentioned, a fit. Right. Now, let me see if I can run to another question.
While you take that time, you could do that. I'm gonna say one more thing to y'all while he does that. I think that, when we think about those things and how we're gonna hold those things, I want to encourage you to recognize that sometimes how we communicate these things will depend on our audience, right? We talk about how we're thinking about, early in the conversation with Shay, we talked about how do you do fundraising, right? In some rooms, there's going to be a need to center people. In another room, it might be a need to center the planet. In another room, it might be a need to center profit. So, conceptually as the leader, I want you to hold them, right? But I want to give you permission to read the room and to know that in your leadership, you may need to move with some nuance. And that's strategy.
All right, thank you. So another question, I think you touched on it a little bit in your earlier conversation with Shay, is what has the 17 plus years of being an educator, what has that taught you about entrepreneurship, and how do you see that as continuing in the work that you do now? I know you touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to reemphasize on it a little bit and kind of see where you draw those lines between your, if you want to call it your past life or your continuing life as an educator.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think about, I say now, at one point, I would be in the classroom with a co-teacher and 50 kids. Like these are 50 freshmen in high school, right? It would max at 50 young people. And I learned to hear conversations across the room. I learned to recognize where there was a need for, this person learned it this way and that person learned it that way. And I learned how to put them in groups based on where there was deficiencies and strengths, right? Where to create something that felt heterogeneous and something that felt homogeneous. And I think in business leadership, that I still am working with that same sense of like being, hyper mindful of the moving parts, and I think even when I was first approaching the build out of Grant Boulevard, while in the very beginning was a super small enterprise, I built it with an intentionality to run it as a corporation. And I don't mean that in like the toxic notions of corporations. I mean in terms of like, there will be structural elements, there will be an intentional architecture that will require me to manage those same 50 people, right? With someone beside me who was helping me to see the landscape, right? A co-pilot, if you will. And I still think of the world of being CEO in that same way. It's actually remarkable, I think, looking back on it, how uniquely being a classroom teacher that long actually prepared me to be a CEO.
Amazing.
My life prepared me to be a founder. My experience as a teacher prepared me to be a CEO. And I never thought about that till right now. So
We are getting
I thought about like the teaching, but I never thought about my life as preparing me. The distinction between founder and CEO, because they're very different. Sometimes people will say like, we don't want to work with the founder, right? Like the founder has a lot of passion, but they don't really understand the business side of things, right? And really, it's like, it's such a sweet spot, and I'm really, really grateful to be able to identify as both of those things, and to feel uniquely prepared to move between them.
All right, so switching on to another question, and this is more so your decision to bring in or start in Grant Boulevard in Philadelphia. What made Philadelphia, I know you have roots here, but what makes Philadelphia a unique place for a startup like yours? And
I did not choose Philadelphia for Grant Boulevard. Grant Boulevard came to me and I was living in Philadelphia, okay? And sometimes, you set up roots where the soil is good, that's where you plant your seeds, okay? And you're right. Philadelphia has so much rich soil. And part of that rich soil, particularly as someone who's interested in fashion design and manufacturing, is Philadelphia has a very long history of being a manufacturing and textile center, which a lot of people don't know. So when we think about early textile production in America, we had these goods, these raw goods coming from the South, and then being turned into, things that would either be exported to Europe or moved across the country up along the East Coast in the city of Philadelphia. So it's really actually it's interesting that that's where we find ourselves in this moment, right? And I think that the other thing that makes Philadelphia particularly remarkable for this kind of work is that this is a city that is, while there are still some challenges with integration, there's a lot of energy around figuring out how to learn, how to really be open to what the challenges of integration require. And integration has lots of challenges. It's a really richly diverse city. It attracts people from all over the world, which is so important to thinking about conversations of impact and sustainability together. And there's so many beautiful neighborhoods where I think businesses like Grant Boulevard really have the potential to thrive, right? So I think that's what makes Philadelphia ripe for Grant Boulevard, and Grant Boulevard ripe for Philadelphia as a first landing pad for how we're working out the build out of what we hope to be a replicable model.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. Now, thinking of legacy, I know you've touched upon it a lot. I'll first ask the question of what legacies did you inherit that you believe has paved the way for the work that you do now? So that's the first part. And the second part being, what legacies do you intend to leave for people that are alive now and people that have not been born yet, that may have may face the same challenges that we face now in our society?
That is such a beautiful question. And I think it's the kind of question that everyone I hope y'all are going to do the playback on that one. So I'm going to say it one more time, because I think it's one I would like to encourage you to ask yourself, right? It's what are the legacies that have you inherited, and then what legacy are you thinking about in terms of what you're going to contribute, right? And that's one that every one of us, I think we can be grappling with. For me, I think, having not thought about that and framed my story, particularly on the back end in that way, the longer narrative arc, I think that one of the legacies that I've inherited is, it depends on how far back I want to go, right? As the descendant of people who were enslaved, there's that legacy. There's a legacy of the Great Migration, which is this legacy of wanting to figure out how to move forward. How to read the landscape and decide that where you're standing is no longer the best place for you. So I inherit a legacy of like, of dreaming, of like that there might be something further ahead of you that just based on your faith and your optimism is something you should reach for. You know, my great-grandparents were great migration people on my father's side, so I think that's part of my legacy. I think more immediately about my biological parents who were entrepreneurs, who really dedicated their lives to thinking about how they could stand in service to the oppressed, particularly those who were formerly incarcerated. My mother spent time, you know, supporting, giving emotional support to women who were incarcerated. My father really could see, right before we had a robust language about the food crisis, he really had a compass for it in his spirit, and I inherit that legacy of mindfulness and observation and action led by observation. So I definitely see that as being a part of that legacy, as pieces of that legacy, and a lot of perseverance. You know, all of those journeys, this legacy of journeying, have always been about perseverance and discipline and courage, right? And then I think about my own personal legacy. I really hope, thinking about it in this moment, that it is very much so in alignment with the continuation of that. You know, not so much the disruption of that or the deviation from that, but a continuation of that, striving for something that seems, you know, lofty and scary and unknown, and being willing to traverse that space, you know, and to build community about what that bridge would, the build out of that bridge would require, the courage and the discipline and the commitment. And I really hope that the other part of my legacy is that, you know, when the larger transcript of my life is read, that there's a theme of really trying to figure out how to be tender with this role of being a steward and a shepherd, and really trying to figure out how to step into that, because it's what I think is the next best thing to do. You know, it's the next best thing. And so I hope that's the narrative arc of how I've continued, and how I've set up a new model for what bold experimentation and courageous innovation might look like.
I just have to think about that for a minute.
Yeah, yeah.
So you say it so optimistically and so hopeful. What are your hopes for this whole new generation of social entrepreneurs, people that seem to understand the difficulties and the challenges that, you know, marginalized communities, you know, face, and we all face as a people? What are your hopes for that space? What are some of the things that you would like to see happen if it was in your lifetime?
If it was in my lifetime, and they were like, just wave that wand, wave that wand. You know, my hope is that we maintain what is so elusive, which is optimism. You know, like, I think that optimism is one of those things that we come close to and move away from. And I hope that, you know, Dr. King, there's so many admirable things about the way he made decisions. You know, don't get me wrong, there were some things that he's human, but there were many admirable things. And he talked about this larger arc and realizing that there was a larger arc to the things. And I hope that we are able to maintain our optimism and our commitment and our perseverance. You know, when we think about the people who've come before us who've had to figure out how to persevere, you know, people who are the descendants of people who are starving in Ireland, you know, people who were being held in concentration camps, people who were being held on ships, right? There's all of the stories of being bound by loss, right? They too had to look at odds that seemed really, and you know, options and challenges that seemed insurmountable. And they had to act with the same sense of like personal perseverance. You know, we can't control all the outcomes. We have to really narrow our focus. We have to weed our own gardens. That's the gardens of our minds. It's the gardens where we live. And if we can just focus on that, and focus on legacy, right? Really hone in on that. Chin up, head down. Then I think that we can do the work of staying in the fight, because that's what it is. And we have to really figure out how to stay in the fight. And I think too, back to that question about legacy, my father was a boxer, and I spent a lot of times as a little girl in a sweaty gym. I mean, sweaty, you know, just moist. But I learned that, I think I am, and by like default, I absorbed a lot of that notion of like, you know, you gotta fight. Yeah. You're gonna take some punches. Some days you'll be discouraged, and you fight. And I hope for us, for our generation in this moment where the world is so at odds with itself, that we are able to do pieces of those things, not necessarily all at the same time, but in doses every day, right? In doses every day, that we are able to tap into that, to find it, to nurture it, to water it, to give it sun, and then to be in community with people who are offering us that as well.
Dr. Kimberly McGlonn, it has been such an honor sitting next to you and having the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I wish we could talk more and go on. I feel like I can do that, but it has been just a wonderful gift to the Temple community to have you. We wish you all the best with Grant Boulevard and your other initiatives, and we're so honored to have you.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be with you.
And thank you, audience. This has been such a great, opportunity for the entire IEI Institute. I want to say thanks to, the IEI Institute, and also congratulations to all the Changemaker Challenge winners. We really, really are inspired by your work, and we hope to, hear more about your successes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly, for your inspiring remarks. And to our two incredible students who have played a huge role in creating today's events, Ebo Jerry Nanu and Shay Marie Strouser, thank you. Both of you are reminders of why, as faculty and staff here at Temple, we do what we do. Keep up the great, great work. The road to success does not stop here for most of our finalists and participants of this year's Changemaker Challenge. Many of our participants will take the next month to prepare their ventures for submission to the 24th annual Be Your Own Boss Bowl, where the IEI awards over $100,000 in cash prizes and more than $75,000 in in-kind service donations. You can scan this QR code in front of you to learn more about the Be Your Own Boss Bowl, open to Temple University students, alumni, faculty, and staff from all 17 schools and colleges. If you won't be participating in the competition, but still want to get involved with the IEI as a mentor, reviewer, or sponsor, please scan this QR code to let us know how you would like to get involved with our programs. We are always looking for support to continue encouraging our Temple Owlpreneurs in their entrepreneurial ventures. And trust me, it is very, very fulfilling. Another way to stay involved with IEI is to attend our events. We have two unique upcoming opportunities that are open to the audience today. The first will take place on Wednesday, March 9th at 11 a.m. as we welcome Manar Morales, President and CEO of the Diversity and Flexibility Alliance. And she will be sharing how to be intentional, inclusive, and iterative in making systematic changes to optimize organizational culture in this new hybrid workplace. And on March 25th, you can join Mid-Atlantic Diamond Ventures for the virtual Spring Forum and hear from early stage ventures from a variety of industries, including technology, life sciences, and consumer products, and have the opportunity to meet and speak to the entrepreneurs and to network with colleagues during the event. Again, I very much would like to thank you for joining us for the 5th Annual Temple University Social Impact Summit. We look forward to continuing to share the impressive social impact ventures coming from our Temple University Owlpreneurs, but also look forward to working and partnering with your organizations in the future as we all strive to improve the communities and world we live in. Thank you again and have a great evening.